If you don't want to be called Nazis, stop doing.
You're called an
You've
been called an anti-Semite more than anyone else's table.
Yeah.
And people would sit there and no, by me, I never called you an anti-Semite. I mean, I'm not sitting here saying
I'm a supporter of the Palestinians, so I'm used to it.
Yeah, I hope your beeper doesn't go off. The thing is that
you just say I should die?
You should not.
No,
Did you just say I should be killed?
No, I did not say that. I said, no, I did not say that.
Hold on.
Did your guest just say I should be killed on live TV?
I said I hope
Guys,
you don't.
let me just stop.
You said you hope my beeper doesn't go off.
Because you said I'm a big supporter
of the Palestinians.
Hamas.
Guys, let me
I said
stop.
Palestinians.
Are you?
Am I what? No, of course I'm not.
Palestinians are not.
I apologize.
Are you a racist, violent person inciting violence against me?
Ryan,
That's disgusting.
that is completely.
No, I apologize.
That
Good
is
job, CNN. Let's
completely
have first
out
block
of
say the
pocket.
Muslim guy
You
should
know
be
that.
blown
I
up
apologize.
on
I
TV.
apologize.
Don't say then
Wow.
I apologize.
I am so honored to have Allison Gill on the show today. She's a fellow vet, used to be a senior official at the VA until she was driven out. I think a lot of people know the story behind the Mueller, She Wrote podcast. She is now the co-host of The Daily Beans. And I've been, I'm a huge fan, Allison. I think you know that. But the last two episodes got me thinking about something that I haven't really considered during the entire course of this campaign, which is that politics for MAGA has become a joke. It's become a punchline. And you match that realization with the idea that cruelty is the point, which Adam Serwer pointed out way back in 2018. And it all sort of starts to make sense. We began this episode intentionally with that awful clip from CNN. And you guys deconstructed that really well on the last episode, better than I've heard. Can you talk about how, I'm going to air quote this, comedy has been a driving force in shaping an ethos on the far right? It's really kind of weird.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you put comedy in air quotes. As the great George Carlin has said, and many others have said, you don't punch down in comedy. And I don't mean that to say that somehow everyone that these MAGA insult comics are going after are below. I'm saying that when you punch down at marginalized communities and you other people, that is against the cardinal rules of comedy. Self-deprecation is great. And punching up is great. But when you're among people who laugh and appreciate the fact that you are insulting others, then you're in a room full of racist bigots. And there's just no other way to put it. And by the way, he bombed in a room full of racists, Tony Hinchcliffe. So that doesn't say much about his actual comedy. And it's because he's using tropes from 1976, like at least if you're going to do racist comedy, come up with some new material. But it's bad. And the cruelty is the point, like you said. And when Gerdusky went after Mehdi Hassan on that CNN panel, it was just so shocking and jarring that what's odd about that is that we shouldn't be shocked and jarred anymore, but they just keep pushing and extending the cruelty of their comments.
I'm glad you called out the shock value of that insult that he leveled at Mehdi Hassan, because I think in their circles, a joke like that is not shocking. We know that Hinchcliffe's jokes were loaded into the teleprompter, right? By Trump staffers. And I was there. I was at Madison Square Garden. It was even worse in person than it appeared on social media. It was a hate fest, right? It was a full-on fascist rally. The comparisons to 1939 are totally appropriate, but you get the sense that this is it's now a movement. I mean, it, started as just a campaign, but it is a movement that has become so insular that it actually believes its own humor. It doesn't realize how the rest of us see it. And I think it's going to be its undoing come November 5th, but hopefully it's going to undo the whole movement.
Yeah, well, that's how cults work, right? You get them in, and then you get them to a point where you can't tell them they're in a cult because they dig their heels in more. And then you hit them with the concentration camps and the Puerto Rico is a floating island of garbage comments. And they're all in because nothing you can say will make them abandon their leader. And so, I mean, that's how cults work. And this is a cult of personality. And that's how fascism worked in Germany, starting in the 30s. And we would be remiss if we didn't learn those lessons without having to go through it ourselves. I mean, the choice seems very obvious to folks like you and I, but to people who are in that MAGA cult, they're like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to believe now, and they just go right along with it, and they really like hurting other people. Yeah. You know, these are the Milgram experiments and the Stanford University experiment. These are folks who now enjoy hurting others. And that's just shouldn't be what our politics is about.
I was interviewed by a couple foreign journalists. I was really surprised and impressed by the size of the foreign press at the Madison Square Garden rally. But it was a conversation with a German reporter that really stuck with me, because when I said 1939, he had this look in his eye, and I actually stopped and I said, what's that about? And his response was basically, we know what happens, right? We know what happens when a society devolves. But in terms of American history, this kind of thing is really anomalous. I talked with Alyssa Slotkin on the show a couple of days ago, who pointed out that successful political movements in America are almost always expansive in their appeal. They are almost always hopeful and optimistic, and they have a vision of America that is genuinely patriotic, not performatively patriotic, right? It's the kind of patriotism that wants to make America live up to its ideals and not revert back to some America that never existed in the first place. And in a way, that does give me hope, because it suggests that MAGA isn't a growth movement. Like, it's only going to shrink. I see you nodding. Do you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, no, I totally feel that. It's got an end point, right? Like there's a point where no more people are going to join into that movement, which is why I think they always want us to have babies, so that they can add to. That's the only way to add to their movement, is a fresh, clean slate. And young people, which they're not going to reach, because Gen Z, I mean, man, the most amazing statistic that I think is one of the most impactful of our lifetimes is that, with Gen X, about 6% of us identify as LGBTQ+, millennials, about 10 to 12%, Gen Z, 1 in 5, 20%. And you're not going to be able to win the hearts and minds of a generation like that with this kind of hateful rhetoric, especially when they are prime targets of it. But, America we're the new kids on the block as far as democracies go. We're the noobs. We're the babies. And so we haven't gone through these things like Germany has, or like Ukraine in 2016 was looking at us like, well, you aren't familiar with Russian disinformation tactics? Are you new? And we're like, yeah, we are new. We haven't been saddled with this for centuries. And so I really hope that we don't go about having to learn our own lessons the hard way, because it could mean the end of the experiment, Yeah,
it could. I do put a lot of faith in those young people, probably too much, in the sense that it's an unfair burden to place on them, right? We need to pull our weight a lot better. But I also get this sense that the MAGA movement feels like this is their last chance. This is their last chance to win, because if they don't change the rules now, that generation is going to destroy them.
Yeah, they're in their death throes. And when something is in its death throes, it is at its most violent and ridiculous. And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing. The Republican Party likes to destroy itself once every 60 years or so. just habit, I guess. And it's because that window of progress keeps moving and leaving certain people behind who are extremists. And those, they'll fight tooth and nail to pull that window of progress back, but they lose every time, because that's how civilizations work. You become more free, more progressive, more modern. And when the people who on the extreme right are left behind, they don't go quietly. So that about every 60 years, it just explodes in their faces. And then they're left wondering, like, where do I go now? It's like, well, you're going to have to come along.
Do you think there is a possibility for a reinvention of the Republican Party, or is something new going to have to emerge from the ashes? I talked to a lot of former Republicans. Rick Wilson is really thoughtful on this stuff. And Rick's analysis is that, the two main legs of the stool are gone, and the third one standing is religious fundamentalism. I don't know how you build a party on that. The other two, of course, were foreign policy, conservatism, and economic policy.
From a marketing perspective, the question has to be, can you refurbish the Republican Party after it's been hijacked by MAGA, or do you have to call it something new with all the Liz Cheneys and Dick Cheneys and Adam Kinzingers and, all the folks who are the Republicans that are voting for Kamala Harris and endorsing Kamala Harris? Do you just form a whole new party, push out Republicanism, call it something new, or do you try to reclaim the Republican Party from the MAGA wing and separate it that way? I am not a marketing major. I don't know the best way to go about this. Tylenol survived their big, problem in the 80s. I think they need to hire a really good PR firm and act like they're a brand, and figure out whether they need to create something new or reclaim the old. But they're going to have to do something. But I think that there is a chance for us to get back to being able to argue with Arnold Schwarzenegger about his ideals of fiscal responsibility, or to talk to Liz Cheney, to have those arguments and discussions again once we're finished saving the republic here. Then we can go back to our corners and argue, but you're going to have to create that party. And again, I don't know if they're going to be able to call themselves Republicans anymore if that name is just too tarnished with, I don't know, garbage.
Yeah. By the way, breaking news, Arnold Schwarzenegger a couple minutes ago just endorsed Kamala Harris for president. So
yeah, that's what I was referring to, his long endorsement that he wrote. There's some things in there that I strongly disagree with.
Me too.
But in the spirit of having a robust debate and the fact that our republic needs at least two viable parties to survive, we don't have another one right now. But I feel one is forming with the hundreds and hundreds of Republicans who understand the assignment during this election, so that they can continue to go forward with a fresh new party. Again, I don't know what you call it. That's a marketing decision. But we need to have those robust differences. But the differences can no longer include hatred and othering and bigotry and fascism and like autocratic ideas. Those aren't viable in a healthy a democracy or constitutional republic, whatever you feel like you want to call it. To not you, but everyone likes to seem to argue over that. But regardless of what you call it, it is what it is, and we need two viable parties, and we don't have two right now. But I feel one is emerging. I
want to interrogate that a little bit, because a rebranding is certainly needed, but it doesn't address the problem of the millions of MAGA diehards, a majority of the party now, by any reasonable analysis. My overriding feeling leaving Madison Square Garden was deep sadness that so many of my fellow Americans have fallen for it. And also fear. I wasn't afraid in the moment, because I think they are saving their violence for after the election, but I was afraid for our country and what it will take to convince that many people that Kamala Harris is the legitimate president. I don't know how we solve that. I don't think a rebranding solves it. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, what would be great is if some social historian went back to look to see what percentage of the Republican Party was still hanging on when it destroyed itself, when it was successfully removed from or changed. Right now, they like to say that they are half of the country. They aren't. They're about 19% if we look at the actual numbers, because they'll say, well, like, for example, my demographic, 53% of white women voters voted for Donald Trump in 2020. But that's 53% of white women voters. And so the percentage is actually much lower. But they use those numbers to say half the country is on our side. It's not. It's down to about 19%. Is 19% low enough for them to end up in the dustbin of history, or are we aiming for 15%? Like, what's I would love it if some social historian or, brilliant PhD in civics would look to see what number we have to get down to in order for it to not be a viable party anymore. Maybe we're not there yet. Maybe it's going to take a little more time and a little more engagement and involvement of upcoming Gen Alpha to make it, down to a, what did Norquist say? Small enough to drown in a bathtub.
That's right.
But not, that's a metaphor. I'm not trying to, say that we should
you're also
literally do that.
Norquist, so.
Yeah, the idea, right? The idea of MAGA. It's small, but is it small enough to leave behind, or do we still have more work to do?
Yeah, well, I think we certainly have more work to do, and more potentially than any other country facing a similar situation, because one of the other differentiators
but we always have more work to do.
One of the things that makes our challenge unique, and it's going to get really dark here in a second, that differentiates us not only from other countries, but from periods in our own history, is the ubiquity of guns, and just how easy it is for a political movement in this country to turn violent, to atomize, to wreak havoc on a scale that is in no way reflective of the movement's actual size. This is kind of the subject of the MeidasTouch film, Against All Enemies. This is what we're most afraid of after the election. And
it's why they're called the 3%ers.
That's exactly right.
Because you only need 3% of a population to overthrow the government, according to...
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that's an allusion to this disproven idea that during the Revolution, the American Revolution, it was just 3% of the population that were super patriotic and won America its freedom. That's what they're referring to, right? When they throw the Roman numeral 3 on their chest, when they do the cosplay thing with their body armor and ARs.
Freedom from a tyrant who was immune from criminal prosecution. Right. Yeah.
The dissonance is, that itself is punchline worthy, except that our democracy is on the line. So it's tough to laugh about, even though the absurdity is kind of funny. Do you have post-election predictions?
Post-election predictions?
Yeah, my big fear is the interim between the election and Inauguration Day, because you can see the groundwork being laid already. I think Madison Square Garden, that rally was not a celebratory occasion. It was not a joyous event. It was the kind of thing that was designed to provoke and incite the most extreme elements of that base. So when called upon, they will take to the streets.
Yeah, that's all that was. I tweeted about that too. This is obviously not a bid to win the hearts and minds of voters and voting blocks in key swing states. It was to stoke political violence, potential future political violence. I think, it's hard to know what the feds are doing because they don't tell us. what they're doing.
Nor should they.
But there are Democrats in Congress who are vigorously doing tabletop exercises on this. And even Jamie Raskin was like, I don't want to tell you the details because I don't want to give anybody any ideas. But there's pretty dark stuff that we're gaming out. So I think we're far more prepared than we were in 2020 and for January 6th, 2021. But when Mike Johnson at the rally at Madison Square Garden, and Donald Trump gives him a wink and a nod and says, we've got a secret, that's where I start thinking about the post-election things in the House. What will the Republican, they still have a majority in the House until January 3rd, if we win the House back. Are they going to change the rules in the House, which they can with a simple majority, to say that you need a 67% vote to elect a new speaker and that you have to have a third of the Congress to approve seating new Congress people, which again, all of this is against the Constitution and would hopefully lose in court. What are their plans to prevent the peaceful transfer of power? What are their games? Do we have some FISA warrants out right now trying to figure out what they're communicating about in order to stop this? And how constitutional is that? It's frightening. I don't know what they have planned, and it's hard to imagine because and you and I have tried to predict what the Republican Party or Donald Trump is going to do, but we don't have cold, dead fascist hearts. So it's hard for us to imagine it. Like if you've ever seen a movie like Human Centipede and you're like, who thought of that? What sick person thought of that? Because that would never occur to me. Yeah. That's how I feel like what they're trying to game out for this particular election cycle. But then they're doing all the regular stuff, filing lawsuits, saying that ballots are being ripped up in Pennsylvania when that didn't happen, which is a lot like what happened with Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss down at counting the ballots in Georgia. They're going to do a lot of that. They're going to file a lot of lawsuits. But the legal team that Harris has in place, that Biden started, is twice the size of our legal team in 2020. And they've got folks like Mark Elias of Democracy Docket. All those people are on our side. We raised $1 billion. Right now, the Save America PAC is $3 million in the red. So I don't know if these lawyers that they're hiring to file all these lawsuits are working pro bono, but that's against the law. And I think we're going to outmoney them and outsmart them on the legal front. But I am very concerned about the physical, what they're physically going to try to do.
It's Ken Harbaugh. Need to take a quick break here because I wanted to let you know that I have finally decided to take the plunge and figure out social media. The Ken Harbaugh Show is now up on TikTok and Instagram and Reels and Threads. I've got a great team pulling all this content together. Please check out the links in the show notes and follow the Ken Harbaugh Show pretty much everywhere. Thanks, as always, for the amazing support. None of this would be happening without you. I have been a part of a couple of those tabletop exercises that you referred to, and the thing that alarms me after every single one is that the blue team, the Democratic team, the first question they always ask is, what's our legal response? What is our ethical response, right? What can we do within the bounds of the law, which should be like the parameters, right? On the red team, they don't have that consideration at all. It's like, what can we do right now and deal with the legal ramifications afterwards? And that's not something that our system is equipped to address. It assumes that government operators are either going to act in good faith or at least in fear of consequences of the law. But that fear of consequences, because of the behaviors of President Trump and just the politics as a punchline approach to politics, that fear of consequences isn't what it used to be.
Well, that's just it. Everybody wants Biden to wield his new immunity. But in order to wield criminal immunity, you have to commit crimes.
Right.
And do we really see Joe Biden committing crimes? it's also antithetical to buck democracy in order to save it, which again puts us at a disadvantage practically because we are rule followers over on the side of actual side of law and order. It's what allowed Bill Barr to land the plane of the Mueller investigation and prevent any obstruction of justice charges from being filed. But fortunately, the one advantage that we do have over 2020 is that the Trump administration is not in power. Yeah. So they can't wield the levers of the executive branch to help them in their quest to steal the election. But I'm very positive about our chances to win this election. But I am also very concerned about what happens in those couple of months.
I think you're right that the most significant difference is that between the election and inauguration, Joe Biden will be the president. And that changes everything. That changes everything. Even
you might not like Merrick Garland, but Bill Barr won't be the attorney general.
That's right. Because the other thing that scared me most from these tabletop exercises was the role of the military. For obvious reasons, I always got thrown into one of those roles. Usually on the blue team, a state adjutant general or something like that. But we know that if Donald Trump wins, one of the first things he's going to do is remove the guardrails that held him in check the last time. We won't have a Milley. We won't even have a John Kelly, who isn't exactly I think he's a patriot in his own way, but I disagree with him on just about every policy. But he did hold the president in check on some of his more authoritarian impulses. Even the John Kellys will be gone in a second term.
You'll have General Flynn and Kash Patel. That'll be who's in charge of the Pentagon.
Right. So that's incredibly alarming. But that becomes an issue if Trump wins the election. Between the election and the inauguration, you're not going to have a president trying to undermine democracy. And that should give us some reassurance. Take a deep breath, everyone. Also, the presiding officer of the Senate will be Kamala Harris. So we do have some safeguards that we didn't have in the run up to January 6th. I'm just putting that out there because I've sensed a bit of hyperventilation online.
Right.
And I think we've got this. It's the atomized violence at the state level that we've got to watch.
Yeah. Yeah. And also to even take what you were talking about with Kamala Harris at the president of the Senate there, we also have to realize that nowhere in the Constitution does it require the new Congress to be seated or Congress members to be sworn in or there to even be a Speaker of the House in order to count the electoral votes. It's a ministerial thing. And then the 2022 Electoral Count Reform Act also kind of backs that up, what we had President Biden sign in 2022. And I think that that's something we have to maybe not worry about as much as, like you said, these lone wolf, violent Brooks Brothers style riots, like they did in Michigan.
Oh, in Michigan. I thought you meant Florida.
But in 2020, they did it in Michigan, right? That was Mike Roman and let's do the violence. And Roger Stone's let's get them. And trying to disrupt the counts at the state levels. I think that is where I'm sure a lot of our states will be prepared for those eventualities or scenarios like that. But there might be some states that are not prepared or are kind of not trying to be prepared to prevent that. We'll see how that turns out. And that's where I'm going to be keeping, much like you, that's where I'm going to be, my focus is going to be is concern for those local electoral counts.
Yeah. Last area I want to cover, since we're both vets, is the role that we play or will hopefully play in helping America heal. But I have a sense that VP Harris is going to win, and we'll have to convince tens of millions of Americans that she's the president. There are very, very few trusted voices left in American society nurses are at the top of the list, veterans are right below them. How do we tap into that without tarnishing it? How do we use the voices of veterans to communicate to the people who we put our lives on the line for, that we gotta move on. We gotta leave the Trump years behind us, and we have to, we have every right to disagree with the incoming president, but that's the president.
I think what we should do, or what we should urge the Harris administration to do, is to create a coalition of veterans and military families. Right now, we have a bunch of small coalitions. We have Vote Vets, we have Common Defense, we have we have so many different groups out there. Well, then we have our actual VFW, VSOs, and veterans, VSO, veteran service organizations. And then we've got, everything is really piecemeal right now. And I would like to see the Harris administration put together a commission to coalesce and consolidate all of these veterans groups who we're all on the same side. Stars and Stripes, Military Times, VOA, bring that back. Put us all in one coalescent togetherness group, and consolidate all of that, all of those voices that are right now just sort of out here trying to do their own stuff, because nobody's really organizing them at the top. Like, we need an ODNI for veterans organizations. That's what I would do personally.
Okay. And do you think the moral weight of the veterans' voice could actually change the tenor of a national conversation if we aligned around this idea that that we're still one country? We may disagree with each other on important things, but we've only got one president.
I think we have evidence of that. When we saw the immediate backlash to the incident at Arlington National Cemetery in Section 60, that came from all sides, both sides, all of the aisle. When the Suckers and Losers information came out in 2020 with Milley and Kelly, who could be consultants on this consolidated group of veterans, Mattis, good old moderate dog Mattis. Right. We could have to bring those voices together. I think that those are the kinds of things that give us evidence that the needle is moving with military and veterans. Maybe not a bunch, but at least a little. And I think that evidence shows us that we can actually be a very powerful, unified voice, that we have one president, and you might not like them, but them's the rules. Like, it's in your handbook.
Right. Well, thanks, Allison. Would love to have you back on. Fingers crossed for Tuesday.
All right. Thanks so much.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Meidas by signing up to the MeidasTouch newsletter at MeidasTouch.com/newsletter.